Good day. It's the 4th of July. We'll make this a pretty quick one. So there's obviously something that loves to happen when we talk about not just the founding of this country, but really the founding fathers and the idea, kind of multiple levels of the idea is really is that we can't judge them on modern day, whatever. Um, Modern day morals, right? That's wrong. I mean, it's wrong on so many levels. And the idea that it's contradictory. It's just wrong. Um, so, there's this idea that some of these folks that these fathers created. I've seen some quotes say something along the lines of they created the greatest force for good and freedom ever, right? This great force for good and freedom, or they knew they were imperfect, and so they set the nation on the path to freedom, and so on and so forth down the line. And well, that's bullshit. In a lot of sense. I mean, there's a handful of founding fathers that knew, or really were abolitionists, I should say. Um, but there's how do we put this? Um, so many of them owned slaves, right? Some of them didn't. Like Sam Adams, John Adams, was it? I think Robert Payne, and some others, right? And then there's some that like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and so on and so forth that also owned slaves, people, humans, and would talk about how horrible it was. At the same time, they didn't sell any of their slaves. They didn't, not sell, sorry, free any of their slaves. They didn't really fight to end slavery. So these folks, that will argue kind of they were imperfect and they knew people weren't ready. But who wasn't ready? They weren't ready. These were the people that owned slaves. They weren't ready. They had power. They were in charge. If they knew it was wrong, then they should have ended it. But they were too invested in the institution of slavery and themselves making money. You look again through Jefferson. I mean, these guys were making bank on this stuff, and beyond that, I mean, they were also clearly horribly white supremacists in a lot of different ways. We absolutely can judge them. They had in no mind in really creating a nation that would somehow live up to these ideals. They explicitly created a nation that codified slavery within the Constitution, three-fifths cause, which wasn't really like a negotiation. It was the South was quite happy with it, among other things, because it helped solidify their power, right? But it was also hypocritical in the fact that these folks saw the people they enslaved, the humans they enslaved, as lesser than them, less than white, so on and so forth, and somehow felt that they were again human enough to be counted in the census to give them more political power. The idea of like three-fifths human, that's kind of it was just political maneuvering to give for power, and particularly for the southern states. But again, slavery wasn't just in the South. It was across the early states at that time, and the territories. But these men knew exactly what they're doing. They wanted to expand west, and in that process commit brutal genocide. They wanted to keep the humans they had enslaved, and also ended up practicing, after the United States so-called banned the slave trade, in human breeding, and there became an internal slave trade. You had, like, with the Mississippi and other rivers, it's, these there be trading posts and breeding plantations. Thomas Jefferson took part in this. He decided it was more profitable to breed humans and sell them, than to have good, strong workers. He found that a black woman who would have kids would be more profitable than, the most, well, built man that could, work a field really well, blah, blah, blah. These guys were horrible human beings, point blank, period. And by saying that we can't judge them also takes away the agency of all the people that were enslaved. They didn't want to be slaves. They didn't want to be enslaved. They knew it was wrong. And let's be also explicitly clear here. Chattel slavery was very different than historical slavery and indentured servitude. Chattel slavery was a very unique form of slavery in history. Uh, and I'll dive into that later and really kind of parse apart these differences because they're important to understand. But chattel slavery is very, very unique, particularly in how it, from birth to death, and your kids too, and it's in brutality. Like you were cattle, right? Historical slavery had much more in common with indentured servitude. You could work it off. Typically, your kids weren't enslaved, and it was usually just, for people that you were at war with, or kind of enemy combatant kind of thing deal, right? You'd kind of work this off being the enemy of a within a conquered territory instead of wholesale enslaving and so on and so forth. They're nothing more than property and money making mechanisms. And they justified it for various different reasons. But the men that owned slaves and felt somehow it was wrong but couldn't free them, some did after their death, but they still had it during their life. Like there's all this cognitive dissonance and these hoops people jump through to somehow put these men on pedestals. And you read through some of their writing, and some of them really aren't that brilliant. And also, the Constitution was stolen from Native Americans, I believe. Was it the Cherokee Confederacy? I'll have to. I'm forgetting exactly what it was. I was looking up a little while ago. I'm blanking on the exact. But there's basically a collective group of indigenous nations. Might have been the Cherokees that, in essence, they wholesale ripped off the Constitution of. But I mean these, it's so-called genius of white men. It's funny how much time you go through the last, let's say 200 years. We'll give it 200 years and not give plus of inventions and so on and so forth. Jack Daniels, right, was invented by a slave. Cotton gin, key part of it. And even past that, folks like Edison, right? A couple of his key inventions were actually by black people. He ran in essence, almost like a corporation. You think of it almost like Apple of a sorts, where he brought on a bunch of people and they would work on things, and he would end up owning the patents of the things they invented. So a lot of those people were women and people of color and black people, right? And you saw this throughout history. Einstein was part of that with his wife, right? So no, these were not good men. These are not men to uphold. They very much intentionally created a nation that would codify the power of property owning white men explicitly, absolutely explicitly, and that was their intent. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it, right? And they even created mechanisms within the Constitution. Well, it's actually really hard to change, and it's really funny with these conservatives that talk about how they created mechanisms for growth and changing to eventually end slavery. Well, one, we know it took an absolutely brutal war to end slavery as an institution, even though 13th Amendment is a little, about that. The Constitution is really hard to change. And two, these exact same folks will end up being at the same time like the original intent, right, of the Constitution. So you can't argue that they created space for the evolution in this country that eventually ends slavery and then be like, only we have to land on the original intent and blah 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 blah. Like again, these contradictions, these hoops to jump through to one justify your own modern day positions, as well as how we uphold these terrible human beings. They were not good people. They did some absolutely horrible things, and that is just again a piece of U.S. history. This nation, you cannot take an honest look and think it has been a great force for good and freedom. It's freedom for who? Freedom for predominantly wealthy white men. They secured their freedom through the protection and use of enslaved people, genocide, not just of indigenous Native Americans, indigenous nations here on this continent, but elsewhere too, right? And the robbery of resources elsewhere through colonization and imperialism. And we still do it to this day in a lot of ways when we've overthrown democratically elected governments because they didn't side with us, because they wouldn't serve our corporate interests. And boom, we put somebody in there that was not so good so that our corporations and could make a lot of money. This nation is one where the state functions to protect capital. I mean, that's the how the state functions. Whatever capital is seen as is to protect it. And the Confederacy was one of the first ways that manifested itself. It was it was created to protect the capital of enslaved humans. They explicitly succeeded to preserve the institution of slavery. The North and Lincoln fought to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. And the emancipation of those enslaved was only a byproduct of the Civil War. It was not the intent of the North or the really United States at that point to do anything about it. And Lincoln had to be convinced. So it's long past time that we take these folks off our pedestals of great men, of great ideas. It's not saying that we can't take any, and it's not saying all ideas there are bad or there weren't any heights to aspire to. But at the same time, you can look at any, again, black folks have fought for this nation's freedom. Like, this nation isn't free. All you non-wealthy white folks, you aren't actually free. You just think you are. You chose safety over freedom and decided that your safety is actually freedom. I mean, you're not enslaved, but you're not free. There's levels to it, right? But that's the thing is you can tell there's a ton of black writers, brown writers, indigenous writers and philosophers that have elevated and spoke much more eloquently and deepened, expanded upon, innovative and really spoke much more, to higher even ideals of what freedom means than any of these founding fathers. And those are the people that we really should hold up on exploring what it means to be free. That's where we're going to find our freedom as a nation. It's in these ideas, in those that have constantly fought to truly be free, not those that secured their freedom through the oppression of others.